Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us for this one. Today we're diving into a fascinating, honestly absolutely crucial concept, and that is the exit strategy. Because look, whether we're talking about a deeply personal setback or a massive geopolitical crisis playing out on the world stage, failures are pretty much inevitable. The real question is, how do we survive them? Well, the answer usually comes down to having a deliberate plan for what happens after the crash. So today, we are going to compare two vastly different arenas to figure this out: a teenager's personal crisis and the staggering global fallout of the 2026 Iran war. Okay, let's start on a very intimate personal scale. This is the story of 16-year-old Arjun. Arjun had just failed one of the most important exams of his entire life. As you can imagine, he was totally devastated. He was avoiding his friends, basically convinced he had just entirely ruined his future. But one evening, he was helping his dad fix up this old bicycle. His father just pointed to a rusty, broken chain on the bike and offered up this brilliant piece of wisdom. He said, "This bicycle stopped because one small part failed. Does that mean we throw away the whole bicycle? No. We clean it, repair it, and try again." Talk about a light bulb moment, right? That realization actually became Arjun's personal exit strategy. He suddenly realized he didn't need to throw away his whole future. He just needed to fix the broken links. So he stopped looking at the overwhelming, scary year ahead of him, and instead he just focused on making tiny, daily micro repairs. Waking up a bit earlier, studying more consistently, actually asking for help when he needed it. And it worked. A year later, he passed his exams with excellent marks and eventually went on to become a highly successful engineer. His motto through it all became, "The day I failed wasn't the day my life ended." Arjun literally found his way out of failure by having a clear strategy for repair. But hey, let's zoom way, way out for a second. What if that broken chain isn't on a rusty bike in a garage, but is actually a massive, vital link in the global economy? What happens when world superpowers face catastrophic setbacks but completely lack that clear, step-by-step exit strategy that Arjun had? To really understand this, we need to examine the harrowing, frankly world-changing events of 2026. We can trace the structural breakdown of the Middle East during that year pretty clearly. It started in late February 2026, when the US and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran, which kicked off a major war. Fast forward to mid-April, and the US had blockaded Iranian ports. Now, a fragile ceasefire was finally achieved in mid-June, but unfortunately, it deteriorated almost immediately, and by early July, hostilities had fully resumed. It was just a rapid, violent cascade of escalating conflict. And the sheer intensity of that initial phase, it honestly cannot be overstated. We are talking about 40 days of devastating warfare right out of the gate. Thousands of casualties in just over a month. And crucially, this 40-day period included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with a really substantial loss of the Islamic Republic's senior leadership. Now, looking impartially at the on-the-ground military reality of those 40 days is fascinating. The US and Israel executed widespread strikes that destroyed a massive amount of Iranian military hardware and leadership compounds. But notice how Iran absorbed those blows. They very rapidly replaced their fallen commanders, selected a new supreme leader, and adopted this novel population-centric mobilization. Essentially, they leaned heavily on active grassroots backing in the streets to secure their internal stability. So both sides were delivering and absorbing incredibly painful reciprocal blows. Which brings us right back to the geopolitical equivalent of Arjun's broken bicycle chain. In response to the attacks, Iran moved to block the Strait of Hormuz. For some context, the Strait of Hormuz is essentially the world's most critical maritime choke point. It connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and cutting it off, that was the geopolitical equivalent of a bicycle chain just entirely snapping in half. 25%. Let that number sink in for a moment. Before the war, roughly 25% of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the global supply of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, passed through this single, narrow strait. On February 28th, that massive lifeblood flow of global energy was instantly choked off. As you'd expect, the downstream economic shocks were immediate and catastrophic. Because that critical link failed, European gas prices surged by up to 45% almost overnight. Qatar, which is a massive energy exporter, was physically forced to just halt its LNG production because its ships literally couldn't pass through the strait. Widespread maritime navigation simply stopped, which led to deep, cascading logistical and corporate system breakdowns worldwide. To give you an idea of how this actually looked on a micro level, just take a look at global shipping entities like Gaslog. As supply chains violently stalled out and shipping routes were blocked, the digital and logistical systems that managed these massive networks experienced deep stress. Websites and communication pipelines faced severe errors and bottlenecks, directly mirroring the physical blockade happening out in the oceans. It's like we said, when the main chain breaks, every interconnected gear just grinds to a halt. Well, what's really fascinating and maybe a bit surprising is that this global supply chain chokehold actually coincided with domestic systems fracturing at the exact same time. The macro stress wasn't just military or economic, it was bleeding into everyday domestic institutions. Like, take a completely different arena, NCAA athletics, right here in the US. In August of 2026, over 100 Division I women's basketball players signed union authorization cards. Around the same time, Oregon State football players petitioned state regulators for formal representation. Why? Because just like a broken global supply chain, their old institutional systems were failing them under stress. They needed a way to repair their own broken links, and collective bargaining was their chosen exit strategy to build a durable solution. So let's bring this all back to our main theme. Arjun, the student, found its successful exit strategy to his personal setback. The college athletes saw collective bargaining as their exit strategy from institutional stress. But the architects of the 2026 Iran war, well, they found themselves entirely stuck in what military analysts call a strategic impasse. When we impartially compare the initial expectations with the stark on-the-ground reality, the gap is huge. The U.S.-Israeli coalition's stated objectives were to collapse the Iranian regime, degrade its nuclear capabilities, and project U.S. power globally. But the actual outcomes? Iran retained asymmetric control over the Strait of Hormuz. A much more hardline military-dominated regime emerged, and the coalition was left in a strategic impasse, possessing absolutely no clear exit strategy. Which brings us to defining what a strategic impasse actually is. It's the inability to translate operational military victories into long-term strategic achievements or to reach a defined political endpoint. The coalition could attack, they could destroy infrastructure, and they could eliminate high-ranking officials. But despite this immense display of force, they couldn't define an acceptable endpoint to justify the staggering costs of the war to their public. They essentially had no way out. On the flip side, Iran managed to generate its own victory narrative by doing exactly what Arjun did, repairing its broken links. Despite absorbing multiple devastating military blows, they preserved and reconstituted their leadership. They successfully leveraged that grassroots population mobilization we talked about, and by securing the Strait of Hormuz, they gained a massively powerful asymmetric bargaining chip. They found a strategic foothold amid the destruction. So it all leaves us with this final really provocative question to think about. Is there a difference between an operational victory and true strategic change? As we've seen today, from a teenager fixing a rusty bicycle chain in his garage to global superpowers deadlocked in the Strait of Hormuz, ultimate success rarely relies on raw power or the initial impact. It relies entirely on your plan for what comes after the failure. Because without an exit strategy, you aren't fixing the problem, you're just breaking the chain. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Look at the broken links in your own life. Do you have your exit strategy?